Studies and the William Andrews Clark Memorial Library. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to this wonderful space of the drawing room for our second in-person event of 2021. Exciting. And also to welcome those of you who are attending via Zoom. We've hosted numerous remote programs, but today is our first hybrid event at the library. Accordingly, we're experimenting with the technology for which this building was not designed, which is normally a good thing. And we're grateful to Kenneth Carmilla and to our speaker, Sarah Neville, for the opportunity to pursue this. More about them in a moment. But first, I wanted to thank the superb people who've organized this event. Eric Bowman, Jeanette Levere, our technologist, Alistair Thorne, who deserves special thanks today, to Kathy Sanchez, Candace Snowdy, Anna Chen, the head librarian, and her wonderful team who've arranged the exhibition with related books from the collections, including those gifted by Paul Chernovsky, who is here today and actually carried a book with him for today's event. So thank you, Paul. Today, it's an honor to introduce the Kenneth Carmilla Lecture on the History of the Book Trade. Ken has been a tremendous supporter of students and the collections, including this annual speaker series. He's president of Kenneth Carmilla Bookseller in Santa Monica, and he's been a dealer in early printed books, art books, press books, general rare books, and materials pertaining to travels and voyages. We're grateful to him for his ongoing support, and so thank you very much, Ken, and we're delighted that you're here, so thank you. And I just wanted to note also that he recently endowed a graduate research fellowship. I think last year was the inaugural year, and so we're really grateful for something that enables us to continue supporting students who also use the collections, which is wonderful. So now it's with great pleasure that I introduce our speaker, Sarah Neville. And I always feel like it's worth saying who actually flew here from Ohio. It still seems such a tremendous feat. An assistant professor in English at the Ohio State University, Professor Neville also holds an appointment in the Department of Theater, Film, and Media Arts. She's an assistant editor of the New Oxford Shakespeare 2016-17 and an associate coordinating editor of the Digital Renaissance editions. Her essays on book history, Renaissance drama, textual scholarship, and digital editing have appeared in Shakespeare, Shakespearean International Yearbook, Variants, Textual Cultures, Notes and Queries, and edited collections. Her monograph, Early Modern Herbals and the Book Trade, English Stationers and the Commodification of Botany, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press in spring 22. And just also to thank the publisher for the opportunity to be able to record this lecture. She is speaking on Herbals, illustrated and unillustrated, selling botany in early modern England. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Neville.
Thank you, Bronwyn, for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for inviting me here to talk today, particularly to Kenneth Carmilla, who makes this possible, and to Eric Bowman in particular, who made this very easy for me to come quite readily from Ohio. I'm still staggered by this building, which I have been in for all of 30 minutes, and I'm just sort of stunned by it. So if I stop in the center of my talk and just stare at the ceiling for a second, I'm not having a fit or anything. I'm just sort of in awe. So my talk is about 55 minutes long, and it's in 3 stages, just so that you're aware of where we are at any given moment. For a century before it was an adjective, the word herbal was a noun. It first appeared in printed English in 1525 in the title of a small, unimpressive little quarto published by a London stationer, a bookbinder named Richard Banks, who had recently acquired a press and began printing for himself. The title of Banks's book was Here Beginneth a New Matter, the which showeth and treateth of the virtues and properties of herbs, the which is called a herbal. The OED definition of the word herbal offers much the same information as that offered by Banks's explanatory title. It is a book containing the names and descriptions of herbs with their properties and virtues. The quarto's title page also features the words cum gratia em privilegio a rege induito, a Latin phrase of such importance to its publisher that he also repeated it on the final page of his volume. Cum privilegio, imprinted by me, Richard Banks, dwelling in London a little from the stocks in the poultry, the 25th day of March, the year of our Lord, 1525. As an earlier form of pre-incorporation economic insurance, the cum privilegio patent that Banks so proudly displayed was a crown dispensation that granted a publisher a chance to earn back their return on investment by preventing another publisher from printing their privileged text for a set period. On occasion, these patents secured a privilege over specific titles, but far more common were what Peter Blaney calls generic privileges that granted the recipient temporary protection for any book legally printed at his or her costs and charges. And it's worth noting that generic here simply means the word in the same sense as general, a patent that's applicable to a large group or class. It doesn't reference genre in the sense of form. Any text that a patent holding publisher chose to print was eligible for this protection. In the case of some patents, such as those held by the king's printer, the term of the privilege was usually for the king's life, but the patents granted to most booksellers were for a shorter and limited period of time of up to 7 years. In 1525, this is exactly the sort of generic privilege that Banks appears to have held and to have indicated with the phrase cum privilegio on the title page and colophon of his Little Herbal. Banks's time as a printer is split between two periods, but he published books throughout his career. The exact terms of the privilege in 1525 are difficult to ascertain because no record of it from his earlier printing period survives, outside of the claims he makes on the title page. However, the terms of a later Banks privilege does survive that indicates he had a dispensation to monopolize individual book titles for a fixed period of 7 years when he chose to print them. It's not clear how Banks managed to acquire a crown-granted privilege to protect his works, but unlike his contemporary John Rastall, who was the brother-in-law of Sir Thomas More, there is no indication that Banks was ever connected to the court. Banks's motivation for publishing The Little Herbal in 1525 must therefore be found through examination of the other books he published during his 24-year bookselling career, as well as by putting Banks in the wider context of the early English book trade in the 1520s and the 1530s. Blaney identifies Banks as one of the first English publishers to give up printing to concentrate their efforts on the more lucrative activity of publishing. And this shift suggests that Banks was a particularly astute reader of the marketplace for printed books in Tudor London. Banks's acuity is confirmed by the fact that the Little Herbal he chose to print in 1525 quickly became one of the all-time bestsellers of the entire 16th century, reaching 18 editions in just over 40 years. Thus it was that through the innovation, effort, and investment of a clever London stationer, the era of the printed English herbal could officially begin. And it was some era. In England, between the first appearance of the Little Herbal in 1525 and the release of John Parkinson's Theatricum Botanicum at the end of the STC period in 1640. The book trade saw the production of more than 24 editions of books identified on their title pages or by contemporaries as herbals. These texts range from pocket-sized, unillustrated octavos to huge folios filled with costly woodcuts, and we've seen some of those already. Their verbal contents range from descriptions of plants to accounts of their medicinal value or practical usage to plants' emblematic significance to the Christian reader of the so-called Book of Nature. They also express the emphatic patriot seeking to demonstrate England's superior natural blessings over those of foreign climates. I judge it requisite that we should labor to know those plants which are and ever like to be inhabitants of this isle, wrote apothecary Thomas Johnson in the preliminaries of his 1636 edition of Gerard's Herbal. For I verily believe that the divine providence had a care in bestowing plants in each part of the earth, fitting and convenient to the foreknown necessities of future inhabitants. And if we thoroughly knew the virtues of these, we need no Indian nor American drugs. Herbals contain indices, tables of contents, equivalency listings of plant names across regional and national linguistic barriers, marginal notations, in-text citations, ornamental type, annotation markers. They are prefaced by authors, by their publishers, and their commenders. They contain addresses to the reader, to patrons, and to civic and royal authorities. Herbals, as many of us know, were sold and resold for great and small sums of money and presented as bequests in wills. And they appear in the book lists of medical practitioners and in the portraits of gentry, identified sometimes by their actual titles and sometimes by the generic marker of herbal. The herbals still extant were hand-colored by their producers or by later owners. They were corrected, annotated, and added to by later readers. And the pages of their copies can demonstrate either heavy use or no use at all. Herbals were mined for ideas by later authors who wrote advice books, as well as by would-be ladies and gentlewomen on husbandry and housekeeping. Gervase Markham, for example, depended heavily on a late edition of Banks's Little Herbal when he compiled his own best-selling work, The English Housewife. On their title pages, herbals sometimes refer to other books currently offered for sale by the same publisher that might also interest potential customers, books that may or may not have anything at all to do with plants. And this is at the bottom of this title page here. It reads, "Also it giveth full perfect understanding of the book lately printed by me, Peter Treveris, named The Noble Experience of the Virtuous Handwork of Surgery." So they contain blurbs for other books sometimes on them. Indeed, the story of herbals can be seen as the story of nearly all early modern English books in microcosm. And it's my contention that to fully understand how herbals came to be and how they mattered for early modern natural history, we need to start with this appreciation of the way that herbal text circulated specifically as books. My goal in early modern herbals in the book trade, English stationers, and the commodification of botany is to reveal how printed books about plants functioned as exchangeable material artifacts within an emerging trade of ideas about the natural world. As artifacts, herbals enabled would-be authors to gather the descriptive botanical information of others and to refine it in accordance with their own experience. Once acquired by readers, printed books of botany thus provided opportunities for additional botanical writing by those who could correct and comment upon the texts that preceded them. Readers also quite literally commented in the form of marginalia upon the material books themselves. Printed herbals thus provided both the occasion and the location for the development of new plant knowledge and the means to store it. Renaissance booksellers, like banks, concerned themselves with these matters because it was clear that Renaissance readers responded to the affordances that printed books offered as much as they did to the texts that those books contained. In short, readers valued herbals as things, as objects that they could hold and objects that they could alter. Organizational materials such as glossarial notes, indexes, or tables, as you've seen here, were selling points that were advertised on early herbal title pages. Readers deprived of such resources in books of natural history would regularly provide these affordances for themselves. My work reveals the ways that booksellers and the printers who were responsible for the manufacture of books variously conceived of the material form of their herbals as they assessed the dynamics of the European print marketplace throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Chief among booksellers' concerns was the saleability of a particular title. And as they considered what to publish next, booksellers were invested in details such as a herbal author's fame, professional status, or their authority to speak on behalf of a particular knowledge domain. The Herbal or General History of Plants, gathered by John Gerard of London, Master in Surgery. Booksellers were also concerned about practical issues, like the size or the format of a volume, its need for illustrations, and any similar books already in the marketplace with which their proposed new title would compete. Herbals, texts that list, order, and describe plants alongside their benefits, are an ancient genre that even predate the development of the codex or the book form. Long before the scientific revolution and the founding of the Royal Society, herbals in scroll and codex, manuscript and print provided their readers with descriptions of individual plants, as well as their medicinal value or usage. After the advent of printing in Western Europe led to an increase in the number of vernacular books produced for retail speculation, publishers soon realized that the printed herbal had a broad appeal to physicians, natural historians, gardeners, farmers, and any other literate folks who regularly engaged with the ubiquitous resource of plants. Stationers, book publishers ably responded to these customer demands. As the genre developed in print throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, herbals came to offer ever more detailed information about plant morphology and habitat, and about harvesting or treating plants to obtain specific effects. Dioscorides, De Materia Medica, authored in the 1st century CE, cataloged about 500 plants. By 1623, a Swiss botanist had described over 6,000. Perhaps more than any other Renaissance discipline, botanical science quickly encountered the three circumstances that led to what Anne Blair has called information overload: the discovery of new worlds, the recovery of ancient texts, and the proliferation of printed books. As opportunities for gathering and synthesizing information about plants increased, the technologies of textual transmission improved to better accommodate this swelling data set. Herbals, material incarnations, as books, consequently makes them particularly suitable for the study of how textual forms both create and affect meaning. Whether of plant identification or of medical exigency, herbals by their very nature assume that their audience of readers comes to them with specific real-world problems to solve. As books explicitly designed to supplement readers' material experience, herbals are a nexus where the fields of the history of science and book history intersect. They are texts deeply attentive to readers' needs and desires as users searched for specific information about the natural world. And this is why the indexes of most copies of Herbals are deeply thumbed relative to the other parts of the book. Over the course of the 16th century, Herbals grew from small unillustrated octavos to giant illustrated folios, and they shifted from reprints of anonymous medieval works to commissioned authorial tomes. I argue throughout my book that by making what I call a bibliographic turn, scholars of herbals can better understand the context in which botanical science developed. Thinking bibliographically about herbals requires a consideration of herbal texts from the perspective of the publishers who invested capital in their manufacture. In order to profit from the production and sale of books, English stationers needed to deploy a sophisticated and nuanced calculus that could enable them to locate the recursive relationship between readers and their books, while simultaneously juggling the financial risk that herbal publication asked of them. My talk today will give you a sample of this kind of bibliographic turn by first exploring 17th century illustrated herbals from the perspective of their readers and publishers. Then we will draw our lens further back to learn the way that these beautiful, large, and illustrated books by local authorities were made possible only because of the existence of a series of much smaller, unillustrated, and anonymous ones. The texts of Renaissance herbals frequently contain explanations of how plants can serve as remedies for ailments. But in The Anatomy of Melancholy, Robert Burton argued that even material books themselves could ease the disordered mind. Along with his recommendation that melancholics improve their moods by studying wholesome volumes of cartography or mathematics, Burton suggested that readers should examine the figures of plants in large botanical books. To see a well-cut herbal, all herbs, trees, flowers, plants expressed in their proper colors to the life as that of Madiolus upon Dioscorides, Delacampus, Lobel, Bonus, and that last voluminous and mighty herbal of Bessler of Nuremberg, wherein almost every plant is to his own bigness. Such is the excellency of those studies that all those ornaments and baubles of wealth are not worthy to be compared to them. In advocating for the benefits of herbals that are well cut, in other words, illustrated with woodcuts, Burton demonstrates what Heidi Brayman calls the extent to which the very materiality of the book matters in establishing readers' attachment to the printed medium. As Sachiko Kusakawa's work has detailed, herbals were among the printed genres that most benefited from new technological developments in book illustration. So it's unsurprising that Burton finds that herbals' salubrious effects can be gained not just by reading, but by gazing upon their engraved or woodcut pictures. To that end, the large format herbals that Burton explains are of particularly wholesome use are those that were widely known for their distinctive illustrations. Burton's investment in the affordances of printed botanical illustration is of a piece with the health effects of reading green that Leah Knight finds is a recurrent feature of 17th century English literary culture, including the phenomenon's association with the elite readers who could afford these lavish and large illustrated books. As night shows, the recursive effects of green reading could be seen not only in approaches to wellness, but also in architecture and interior design, as Renaissance readers manipulated the leaves of illustrated herbals into new forms, as imagined and literal decor. 16th century botanist Leonard Fuchs, who was particularly invested in illustration, puts the benefits of such books in this way in his own herbal. And here's a translation, because that's of course in German. There is the wondrous pleasure that will permeate your soul on contemplating so many kinds of plants, and will invite you not only to the love, but to the defense of herbal medicine. Fuchs is a physician. For what could be more pleasurable, more enjoyable than to gaze upon plants, which Almighty God has painted with so many varied colors, has decked with the most elegant flowers, whose colors no painter ever could completely express, and then has adorned with fruits and seeds of the greatest use as condiments and medicine. Given that Renaissance readers had such widespread appreciation for botanical illustration, it is not surprising then that printed images of plants also found their way into the needlecraft of gentry women by providing them with patterns. Herbalist John Parkinson recognized the potential in his Paradisi in Sol Paradisus Terrestris of 1629. Although borage and bugloss might as fitly have been placed, I confess, in the kitchen garden, in regard they are wholly in manner spent for physical properties, or for the pot, yet because anciently they have been entertained into gardens of pleasure, their flowers having been in some respect, in that they have always been interposed among the flowers of women's needlework, I am more willing to give them place here than thrust them into obscurity. Parkinson's woodcut illustrations in Paradisi are roughly 4 times larger than those in other herbals, taking up the entirety of the folio page. And it's a small wonder that women would find them useful as patterns for needlework. A copy of Paradisi, now held in the Library of Congress, features 18th century embroidery patterns pressed between the pages. As Rebecca LaRoche suggests, Elizabeth Isham made use of the woodcuts of printed botanical books like Parkinson's in just this way, to quiet her agitated mind. Isham's autobiographical diary, dated 1638, echoes the way that her contemporary Robert Burton made use of printed herbals to distract from his own melancholy. Isham reveals that through embroidery, she delighted much in flowers' several shapes and colors. It kept me from those thoughts, which was hurtful to me. Other herbal readers found these illustrated books so attractive that they were dangerously distracting. The diary of Puritan Samuel Ward itemizes looking at herbals in a list of sinful behaviors. May 17th, 1595. Thy wandering mind on herbals at prayer time and at commonplace. Also thy gluttony the night before. By the time that Robert Burton and Elizabeth Isham were writing in the 1630s, herbals had been so long associated with botanical illustrations that they had become a requisite part of the genre. Samuel Ward's remarks suggest that botanical illustrations in printed books may have been appealing and potentially damnable even 4 decades earlier. But though the benefits of pictures now seem obvious to modern readers, particularly those inclined to marvel at herbals for their beauty, Renaissance authors' appreciation of printed book illustration emerged more slowly. Not all authors of works of natural history or medicine were initially convinced that illustrations were useful substitutes for traditional verbal description. Some authors were concerned that portraits drawn from living examples represented only a particular specimen, and thus were inadequate to describe a species' fuller and more varied natural appearance. More useful than illustration, it was argued, were copious and detailed verbal descriptions that required readers to apply their own judgment as they evaluated their particular specimens. Nonetheless, a combination of the advancement in printers' technical expertise and an increased authorial investment in illustration eventually enabled herbals to be used as identification tools for the description and classification of plant species that early modern English readers found, either at home or abroad. It was these improvements in both the form and the content of herbals that were valued both by needleworkers and by melancholics. While the typically large folio size of these publications limited their utility as field guides, the comprehensive nature of their texts in outlining plants' virtues made them of pragmatic interest to medical practitioners, scholars, and literate lay people alike. And in some cases, a demand for large books could lead directly to the production of smaller ones. William Ram, for example, created an unillustrated abridgment or epitome of an English translation of Dodones that he titled Ram's Little Dodones. It came out in 1606. Ram wrote in his introduction that he hoped to make the most salient features of Dodones, which was translated by Henry Light's work, available to readers unable to afford the larger volume, by drawing that into a handful which before was in the compass of a great garden. Ram suggested that he needed to create the epitome specifically to serve the underprivileged but deserving would-be herbal reader. So, whereas the great book at large is not to be had but at a great price, which cannot be procured by the poorer sort, my endeavor herein hath been chiefly to make the benefit of so good, necessary, and profitable a work to be brought within the reach and compass as well of you, my poor countrymen and women, whose lives, health, ease, and welfare is to be regarded with the rest at a smaller price than the greater volume is. What herbal authors' hesitancy about illustration means is that for a long time the images accompanying printed works were not drawn from authors' descriptions, but were supplied from publishers' existing stocks of woodcuts, many of which were copied originally from manuscripts. Wynkyn de Word's 1495 English translation of Bartholomeus Anglicus's illustrated encyclopedia, Liber de Proprietatibus Rerum, features a chapter on botany, headed by a large woodcut of an orchard, foregrounded by a field of plants. Even by the standards of incunabula, de Word's early woodcuts are primitive and likely copied from his manuscript original. And the single illustration accompanying this chapter on trees offers very little to make the book useful to identify distinct specimens of plants or trees. Though the leaves on the trees differ slightly from each other, they largely share the same trunk morphology. As you can see, they're the same shape. And the herbs in the foreground are similarly patterned rather than distinctive. Over the next century, two publishers saw enough in the text to risk publishing it again. Thomas Bertholet's edition appeared in an unillustrated version in 1535, and Thomas East published an updated and revised version in 1582. Between Bertholet's edition of 1535 and East publication in 1582 occurred a turning point in botanical book illustration. Illustrated herbals on the continent were extremely popular, going through dozens of editions in multiple vernacular languages. In England, William Turner's 3-volume herbal had been circulating since the 1550s. The new woodblock that East commissioned for his edition of the text bears evidence of the publisher's awareness of this shift in European readers' expectations for botanical book illustration. After all, he could simply have repeated the copy of the woodcut as he did with the text, but he chose not to do it. The image clearly exhibits both the artist's awareness of distinct species of plants, like the plantain on the bottom left and the violet on the bottom right, as well as the changing trunk shapes that can result from the different locales where trees might grow. The tree overlooking the river slopes down toward the water, while its roots mound up to keep it fixed firmly on the bank. East's decision to change the botanical illustration accompanying his text demonstrates the ways that Elizabethan publishers considered the norms established by other printed books in the marketplace as they added features and affordances to distinguish the new volumes. Earlier, I noted how 17th century figures like Robert Burton and Elizabeth Isham believed that viewing ornate woodcuts of plants was a form of healthy recreation. The robust contemporary trade in botanical images, cut from the pages of antique books, indicates that these printed illustrations of plants continue to attract and fascinate our gaze. Yet one of the most regularly reprinted books in 16th century England was a short anonymous herbal that contained absolutely no illustrations at all. And I mentioned it to you before. In 1525, Richard Banks printed and published a small quarto herbal of 207 short chapters, which showeth and treateth of the virtues and properties of herbs. In the absence of documentary records testifying to the activities within a particular bookshop or printing house, it is difficult for a modern scholar to determine a Renaissance publisher's success in anticipating the attractiveness of an edition to his or her readers. However, the extant evidence of reprinting the same or similar titles strongly suggests that an earlier edition had sold out. Therefore, Banks's immediate reprinting of his 1525 edition the following year in 1526 indicates that his sense of the little herbals' appeal to Tudor readers was absolutely correct. The book was a sufficiently desired textual commodity among London customers that Banks not only profited from its manufacture, but he did so quickly. This kind of commercial speed, selling out a first edition very fast, was rare. Only 12% of speculative works printed before 1580 were popular enough with book customers to merit a second edition within a year's publication of the first. And the popularity of the little herbal only continued to grow and grow. By 1567, the little herbal and variations upon it had been reprinted at least 18 times by at least 15 other publishers, testifying to the value that both booksellers and readers saw in this profitable little book. Taken as a whole, the existence of the little herbal's many editions confirm that, once in print, this little book was in unusually high demand. We know this, as well as my earlier statistic, through large-scale comparisons using the 36,000 records of the English short title catalog as our data set. These quantitative analytics, formulated by Alan Farmer and others, help scholars establish norms that can determine the relative popularity of books in the London book trade. When considered alongside everything else that the book trade had to offer Renaissance readers, we can see categorically that the little herbal was an unequivocal and runaway bestseller. Only 1.8% of books first printed between 1473 and 1580 reached 18 editions by the end of the STC period. Less than 1% of books first printed before 1580 reached 18 editions within 40 years. And there's more. Given new research on loss rates and the fact that several of the little herbal editions survive in only 1 or 2 copies, so a couple of these, there's only 1 or 2 left in the world. So given that, there is good reason to think that there were probably at least 2 more editions of the text which are now completely lost to us, bringing our total number to 20 editions. Yet despite an influx of recent scholarship on the influence of printed botanical texts on early modern authors and readers, scholars have largely dismissed this little herbal as being of little interest to those concerned with issues of botanical or intellectual authority. If the little herbal publications are mentioned at all, they're generally noted only as a contrast to display the comparatively authoritative status of illustrated herbals by folks like William Turner, John Gerard, and John Parkinson. But while the unillustrated little herbal does not fit with modern expectations for the genre, the copious surviving evidence of the text in print testifies that 16th century readers found much to like in this book. Yet while both Turner and Gerard's herbals are often used as resources by scholars seeking to uncover William Shakespeare or Edmund Spenser's botanical understanding, the little herbal is virtually ignored as a viable botanical resource to explain an author's use of plants like rosemary, borage, catnip, or wormwood. Unlike its longer descendants, the little herbal lacks a clear author to demarcate its authority, and scholars who write commentaries for literary texts prefer to rely on impressive-looking illustrated works. Gerard's herbal has been found in the libraries of John Milton, Anne Clifford, and John Donne, but it is hard to argue that it was anywhere near as popular as its much smaller forebear. It is quite possible that more copies of the little herbal were circulating in 16th century London than of all the other supposedly authoritative herbals combined. Yet this little volume remains relatively unknown. The most popular early modern texts, in other words, were not always the largest and most imposing ones, but have had a better chance of survival in famous libraries or notable collections. The unillustrated little herbal's amazing commercial success raises the possibility that despite the wonderful accounts of herbals we have in the diaries of Burton, Isham, and others, the audience for English herbals did not rise and fall with the expensively illustrated texts preferred by elite scholarly readers. The little herbal's popular publishing history reveals that it was the purchasing preferences of Tudor London's middling readers that created the economic conditions that later allowed the large illustrated herbals to come into being. In other words, these large books with named authors were a secondary development. An examination of the distinct editions of the little herbal demonstrates that the later association between herbals and particular botanical authorities did not result from readers' perceptions of their accuracy, but instead can be traced to commercial concerns. Their publishers' desire to sell an old and clearly profitable text in innovative and distinctive ways. The curious case of the little herbal demonstrates that to uncover the true origin and evolution of the printed herbal, historians need to be attentive to the economic and material circumstances governing the production and circulation of books. Uncovering the whole history of the best-selling little herbal in print is the subject of my book's 4th chapter. There I explain that the little herbal does more than simply pave the way for larger later editions. As different publishers experimented with different ways of presenting the herbal in print, they tested new affordances and marketing strategies that influenced how English readers would respond to the herbal genre. For example, in the 2nd edition of the text, Robert Wyer capitalized on early modern knowledge of a medieval manuscript poem about plants known as the Macer Floridus as an attempt to sell more books. And you can see those on the right-hand side of the image behind me. More interestingly, he also supplied his 2nd edition with an important new textual affordance that demonstrated his understanding of the way that his readers engaged with these little books. Wyer added printed marginal notations alongside the body of his text, highlighting keywords for readers scanning to locate plants appropriate to various ailments. In the period before indexes were keyed to pagination, such marginal notations meant that readers searching for remedies for worms, and there were so many of them, or as a means by which to deliver a woman of a dead child, needed only to scrutinize the margins of a herbal's pages. Wyer's new Herbal of Macer of 1544 was the first English herbal to recognize that such a compendium might better serve its readers if it were accompanied by organizational markers. The decisions made by innovative publishers like Robert Wire and others as they repackaged the Little Herbal demonstrate that authority and authors gradually became a useful mechanism for distinguishing one's wares in the competitive marketplace of early modern London. So, what might have accounted for the Little Herbal's popular appeal in print in Tudor London? It might have had something to do with the affordances of the text banks printed, the medieval Agnes Castus text, which survives itself in more than 36 manuscript copies. The Agnes Castus text alphabetized chapters helped to speed readers' ability to locate desired information about plants and remedies. These novel medieval conveniences for information management, in turn, were intensified by the standardization afforded by the new medium of print. In searching for a popular work in which to invest, publisher Banks seems to have realized that this well-liked medieval text had not yet appeared in print, and he set about to remedy the gap, mirroring the user-based conveniences that had lately accompanied the work in manuscript. Many of the remedies and folk accounts of plants that were first outlined in the Little Herbal later made their way into the massive botanical tomes of Turner and Gerard. By then, the user-based medieval affordances of alphabetization and tables had become so commonplace as to be expected. But as I've been saying, before these large authorized volumes of knowledge became available, Tudor readers clamored for these smaller printed herbals, and booksellers resoundingly obliged. Because extant medieval manuscripts confirm that there was nothing new or original about the textual content of the Little Printed Herbal that could account for its widespread appeal, its extraordinary popularity must have been due to its increased availability within the new medium, demonstrating its first publisher's skill as a reader of the dynamic marketplace for English books. Of course, modern historians, considering Banks's ability to evaluate the texts that would best sell in London, are left only with positive evidence of his selections. We don't have a means of knowing what other text he considered and then rejected. But we can judge from the multitude of subsequent editions that Banks's initial decision to publish was widely and rapidly copied by his fellow booksellers. And these many reprint editions suggest that the economic benefits the Little Herbal offered were amply evident to others in the trade. The breadth of investment that these distinct stationers gave to this small herbal totally belies modern scholars' simplistic, content-based understanding of its import. When considered not as a text, but as a book, the little volume was clearly valuable to booksellers and to their customers in ways that we lose sight of when we decouple medium and message. I'm almost there. Other features of the Little Herbal raise additional questions about the relationship between texts and the books that contain them. While Fuchs de Historia was celebrated throughout Europe for its naturalistic woodcuts, all of the editions of the Little Herbal were unillustrated, and the text descriptions of plant morphology are too vague to be useful. More curiously, the plant descriptions of plant morphology depend upon readers having a pre-existing acquaintance with the subject. Anise hath leaves like to fennel, but seed some deal broad, as orange seed is. Commonium leaves are much like to colander. Dragantia has leaves like to rue, but it hath white specks. In order to use the Little Herbal, in other words, a reader must already be familiar with the nature of its subject matter. The work, therefore, complements the plant knowledge that an early modern reader would bring to the text and offers very little to the botanically illiterate. Yet, despite these unlike the large illustrated and authorized herbals with which it shares a genre, the herbals printed by Banks and those who followed him were not compendia of the best and latest botanical information, but gathered by informed readers. To gain any practical import from these little herbals, readers were required to be critically active and to bring as much knowledge to the text as they could take away. It was familiarity with local plants rather than the novelty of exotic ones that provided much of the book's appeal to readers. This appeal was readily capitalized upon by Tudor publishers, whose very livelihoods depended upon their knowing exactly what Tudor readers wanted. Such assumptions of a competent reader using a herbal not as a self-sufficient authority, but as a guide to individual memory, is consistent with what historian Brian Ogilvie finds was the norm for natural historians operating in the second half of the 16th century. Ogilvie argues that published descriptions of plants provided by botanists served as the final stage in the condensation of experience. Printed books enabled botanists to share their experience with others in the Republic of the Letters. Yet the evidence of the 18 or 20 surviving editions of the Little Herbal, however, suggests that the use of printed herbals as a guide to experiential memory was occurring even in the simple botanical books that were designed for a much less sophisticated reading public. The answer to the question of the Little Herbal's popularity with readers may be found not in its novelty, but in the way that the text of the book reinforced its readers' existing botanical knowledge. Small Herbal's lack of botanical originality and their initial failure to proclaim recognized authorities may be the reason that scholarly works have either dismissed them or disregarded them. As earlier English herbals lack both authorship and originality, histories of the English herbal regularly begin with the works of Turner and descend through the volumes of Gerard and Parkinson to explore how the labors of these men led to the creation of a uniquely English genre of scientific book. But as the products of both late medieval scriptoria and early Tudor stationers ably demonstrate, the genre of the printed herbal in English preceded the efforts of these named authors. In the words of Wendy Wall, authorship bears the mark of things unauthorized. In prioritizing authors and authors' botanical discoveries over stationers and their editions, scholars of herbals have largely overlooked the fact that a herbal was unarguably one of the most popular English books of the 16th century. And they've somehow missed the fact that thousands of early modern readers between 1520 and 1560 were eager to access botanical information however they could find it. Despite its quaint readability, abdicated authority, and ambivalent functionality, the 18+ editions of the Little Herbal testify to the existence of a robust popular reading culture for natural history in the first half of the 16th century. This is the context that would enable beautiful illustrated herbals to appear in print, because the smaller volumes had demonstrated an eager market. When we don't consider the practical means by which ideas spread, a scholarly focus on the history of ideas can lose a great deal of important material context. Seemingly insignificant works, such as the Little Herbal, together with its multiple reprints by these many publishers, demonstrate that the English public, like its continental brethren, was eager to own botanical works printed in the vernacular, and they were repeatedly willing to pay for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for really an exemplary paper. I thought that I understood something about herbals before the talk, and I realized that actually there's an entire history that was new to me. So I'm grateful for that, and I have a number of kind of small questions, but I'm sure you also have questions. So please raise your hands, and I'll. Okay. Paul first.
Yeah, I have two questions and a couple of comments. First of all, I wonder if the content of the herbals, from what you said, it sounded like the answer is no, but did the content of these small herbals change much over the years? And if it's small, it has to cut on something. Is it likely the number of plants described? but also was the greater emphasis on the botany, the description of it, or the medicinal properties of the plants? And then a couple of comments. One thing you noticed in Gerard's herbal is all the correspondence he had with people around Great Britain and across the world, which is sort of indicative of great interest in this and how international it was. And secondly, for the great herbals, the sharing of woodcuts from various versions of the herbals printed both on the continent and in England. I think there's a great sharing there. So a couple questions and a couple comments that maybe you have comments about.
Yes, the answer is yes to all of the things you just said. So the first thing you asked about if there's variations between the 18 editions of the Little Herbal, and for the most part, the greatest variations occur in the Robert Wire. I guess I can't change it right now, but there's the Wire editions that are listed here. There's 3 of them. Wire changes, he reorganizes a lot of the text of the herbal, and it's clear that he's starting with something that was printed by Banks, and then he's supplementing it with something else. It's not entirely clear what he's doing, but the source text, and bibliographers and textual scholars all agree that it is, in all intents and purposes, the same work that has been reorganized and supplemented. So it's the same, I consider it to be the same text primarily. What he does, though, is he adds the humoral characteristics to all of the plants. In most of the other small herbals, those only appear in about half the book. It seems like he's gone somewhere and found more information about what those plants could be. You're absolutely right that Gerard was an extremely well-connected figure in late Elizabethan London. He was extremely well known. And when Norton commissioned Gerard to take over the creation of that herbal, because Gerard's herbal was the publisher-led enterprise, Gerard was brought in long after the fact. Norton wanted a herbal, he had the money for it, he had the woodcuts or the wood blocks that he could use that he had borrowed from the continent through the Frankfurt Book Fair. He hires Gerard and he says, make me this book, write me this book. Gerard had a lot of friends to draw from, and that's one of the attractions, I think, for that as well. And yes, the woodcuts come from a German herbal. I'm trying to remember exactly which one, but they're different wood blocks that are used in the 1597 Gerard from the reprint in 1633. He couldn't get those again. So he borrowed from oh, his name is blanking on me. I'll get it in a second, but he was able to rent the other wood blocks. Was there one more question that I have missed? Yes, people were definitely doing that. So one of the things, yes, marginalia in all of these herbals is often simply offering additional names of plants in other languages or other regional monikers. And so the poster slide, the initial poster slide of my talk gives an example of that at the feet of that female mandrake. Here's female mandrake. And it's a Latin book, it's not an English book. So here's somebody coming in and translating to clarify. And that's a pretty common bit of marginalia to see in these books.
Thank you for that talk. I wanted to ask you to say, and actually this follows directly on what Paul was just asking, about your thoughts about the use of these books, because it struck me, well, you made this point at the end about people would have known a lot of these plants before they got the book. And that was pretty obvious because a lot of these plants are, what a violet is and what a borage plant looks like. But what you're interested in is how, if you make a tea with it, what it will cure. Well, I wanted to, since you didn't show us much marginalia, ask you about recipes and whether, although you showed us one with the marginal printed notations about diseases they were good for, but as you know, I'm sure there's a very lively manuscript recipe book culture in the same period. And I'm wondering how those intersect and whether you find marginal recipes at all, specifically for how plants are combined or et cetera.
Sometimes, yes, sometimes you do. The thing about these little herbals, they're very small, right? They're octavos, they're quite small. And the ones that survive, almost all of them have been 18th or 19th century rebound. And they are extremely tightly bound. They are exceptionally cropped, like the one that I showed you, brutally, brutally cropped. So the answer is probably yes. Often the things that I see are annotations that are simple underlining. And like when I mentioned worms, there's one copy of one of the little herbals in the British Library where somebody is extremely concerned about wicked wind. So this person has gas and has annotated this book very thoroughly with all of the recipes and all of the plants, and there's some annotations. And there's also some books that occasionally, depending, I guess, on the provenance of the particular book, you'll see recipes or other notes that have been bound in, or things that have been slipped in, like that embroidery pattern that I mentioned. So these books are tending to do a lot of different kind of things, of which recipes are one part, but they're also locations for the usual sorts of marginalia that Bill Sherman talks about appearing in books. You get recipes, but you also get like pen trials and kid doodles. And I get the sense at some points with some of these herbals, the Gerard, and others, that almost they're like some parent has let their kid with a watercolor box at some point in the 18th century just kind of go nuts because it's not clearly an adult painting.
Thank you. That was a great lecture. Thank you. Since you say these herbals are basically marketed to botanical literate, botanists, physicians, and then maybe extending to natural philosophers. Can you hear me okay?
I'm having a little bit.
Since you say that these books are being marketed to botanical literate, primarily botanists, then physicians, and possibly extending out to natural philosophers, I'm wondering what marketing devices publishers might use to enhance sales. Is there evidence, like for German and Italian Renaissance botanicals, there's systematic hand coloring by publishers, or the use of more ornate allegorical titles because the illustrations are, they have to be cut and dry. They're supposed to identify, simple and identify, or citations of Islamic authors to market erudition, or cutting edge tech illustrations of alchemy like you get in Mattioli. I think I've gone far enough, but I'd like to have a sense of that for the English herbal. Thanks.
So there's a lot of things that you're mentioning. Those things that you are mentioning tend to be seen closer to the end of the 17th century in England than in the beginning. We're not seeing claims to authority operating in quite the same way that we come to associate with the meaning of that term in these smaller herbals. What we do start to see, though, is an association of herbals with medical practice and medical lore. So the Great Herbal, which is the first illustrated printed herbal in England, which comes from a French text, Le Grand Herbier, it's a translation of that, but it is reprinted for the third time in 1539 by a printer named Thomas Gibson, who becomes a physician shortly after that. And as he edits that text, Gibson alters some of the authoritative posturing of that text to suggest that medical practice, that the herbal up to that point, this is a useful book for somebody who wants to know what remedies to look for. Gibson alters that text to suggest, first of all, he alters it so it's no longer a Catholic text. Instead of praying to Our Lady, you pray to God. That's and I have seen that in marginalia that gets crossed out, but he replaces it in the printed text. So those hints of Catholicism get erased. But more than that, Gibson suggests that medical practice should only occur under the sponsorship of a physician, of a doctor. So herbals go from being something that is taking folk knowledge and putting it into the book form, and everybody gets a piece of it, to this is now an authorized bit of medical knowledge, even though Gibson didn't authorize it, he didn't author the book himself, he just sort of edited it. And because he's also the publisher of this book, he literally has a vested interest in marketing this book in a particular kind of fashion. Mm-hmm.
100-year-old tradition,
Right.
you know, is following the field surgeon. So herbals primarily are always, I mean, at least the manuscripts and the printed books. I mean, the reason medieval manuscripts tend to be anonymous is they present themselves as Dioscoridian. So, I mean, they really had always been primarily medical books in a sense, right?
Well, they also had been simply descriptive books too. And one of the things that starts to happen in the way that we talk about them is they are also of interest for agriculture. They're also of interest because they provide information about textiles. The Great Herbal has plant information, but it also has information about animal parts, like the bone in the heart of a heart is an elk, is a little bit of sort of pharmacy that apparently was deeply prized. Other elements of mineral stuff that Dioscorides doesn't necessarily talk about would kind of find its way into herbals, which were these texts that were kind of thought of as having vegetable use value in all of its respects. But one of the challenges is that Dioscorides is mostly focused on what loosely we can understand as like Mediterranean plants. And so a lot of what early botanists were doing is trying to reconcile those plants within other landscapes. It doesn't make sense to be looking for Grecian plants in Ireland necessarily, though that was what a lot of effort was spent, particularly in the 15th and 16th centuries, trying to reconcile these two things and realizing, oh, wait a minute, this can't be, there's got to be different plants specifically for England. England has its own English plants, and they're going to be just as good, by the way, as whatever the Spaniards have. And so you can see this kind of ambivalence towards novelty and this deep focus on indigeneity operating as well in these texts, but they take a little bit of time because certain texts have to be just more broadly available before those comparisons can be made. Other questions?
So I was really interested in this book's not having an author. And it's a little book. And in thinking about the other books of the same period that didn't have authors, like the recipe books or the books of wise advice. And I never really thought about the difference between larger, more important books, I guess, that did have authors and things like this. Are they compilations? Are they based on manuscript sources, again, compilations, or I just like to hear some comments on the similarities of these, and are they similar to the recipe books and books of secrets, things like that?
They're not really similar to recipe books or books of secrets. They're similar to manuscript herbals, Anglo-Saxon herbals, similar kind. They're the herbal form, a great big list of plants, and what you can use those plants for is effectively its own genre. So occasionally, some of these recipe books or some of these books will contain marginalia that have some of these recipe books or materials that suggest somebody is using a herbal alongside a recipe book. But one of the things that happens in the middle or so of the 16th century is William Turner, physician William Turner, before he has made his great big herbals, he has authored just a list of plant names and translated them into English and explained what some of these plants that the European herbals have in them mean in an English botanical landscape. And he writes there in those early, this 1538 or so, that this is necessary because this information is simply not available. Nobody in Cambridge can teach me this information. I have to provide this information. And so herbals come to be seen as something adjacent to, like a reference text that is useful for understanding some of these other things, some of these recipe books, some of these accounts of alchemical practice or something like that where plants are mentioned. We need a reference book that explains what this thing could possibly be in our language, in our vernacular.
So you mentioned that the Richard Banks first edition sold out very quickly. Do we have any way of knowing how many were printed in that first edition?
We have educated guesses. So in order to justify doing the work of printing a text, there's an economy of scale. So for early, too few, it doesn't justify the labor of assembling the type, paying people to assemble the type. But too many, and you might not be able to sell them. And that certainly happens with some herbals, especially the bigger ones that take a lot longer to sell out. A conservative estimate would be about 500 copies. That's what I'm generally using for a text that you're not sure if there's going to be a market. 500 copies to maybe 700 copies would be a fairly reasonable estimate for a book of this size.
I'd like to ask a kind of follow-up question to a couple of these. In thinking about the marketing of the books, the first is just a very small follow-up question, which is I'm wondering if there's any possibility that the second edition that came out so quickly was because of problems with the type. Like if there were a lot of people correcting it, because you would think that if this is the first herbal, that there may have been a lot of people saying, no, you've got it wrong. This is the wrong plant. So that's one thing. But what I'm particularly interested in is if there's any evidence for how they were marketed in terms of like itinerant booksellers, or would they take them apart and post one of the descriptions on like the shop front, just something around the kind of like really thinking about how they're marketing it. And it's in part because I'm intrigued with the way that you have talked about them in relation to people coming to them with knowledge, so that there's something around that I wondered if there's a specific form of marketing, not just the normal thing we associate with books.
Right. So the second edition of Banks, so I've collated a lot of these and compared them. The second edition of Banks is a line for line reprint of the first. There is a kind of great error in the first. It's instead of matter, there is a misprint in the very title. So he didn't proof it very well, where he says instead of matter, M-A-T-E-R, it's mirror, M-A-R-E-R. And in the typeface, that can't be an error of type sorting. It's an error, a proof correction of some kind. But one of the things that I argue is that it sets up Wire for noticing and coming up with the Macer edition volumes, the ploy, the Macer marketing ploy. Macer had nothing to do with those books, but because in the English typeface that is being used, an R and a C are very similar. So if you're kind of scanning quickly, you can be like, oh, Macer, wait, no, I'm going to use that. And it worked out pretty well for Wire. He was able to splash Macer's Herbal on the running head of one of his editions as a selling point. Wire was doing all kinds of cool stuff, trying to figure out ways to differentiate his books. In answer to your other question, it's tempting, I didn't have time to go into this, it's tempting to view the evidence of all of these publishers publishing the books that they were competing with each other in some kind of cutthroat fashion. The evidence actually suggests the opposite. These publishers are all very adjacent to each other. Their shops are close to each other. They are co-publishing with each other on a regular basis, which indicates that they are not acrimonious with each other. In fact, they're hiring each other to print for them when their shop is too busy doing something else and they have excess money that they want to spend. And there are other books like the Herbal, not published anywhere near as popularly, but reasonably popular, that suggest that they were almost working together to create books that could be small octavo volumes that could be easily bound together on subjects like urine analysis, a separate book of medicines, printed medicines, but also a book of the justice of the peace, which is basically like a list for all of the elaborate hierarchies for like bailiffs and sheriffs and stuff in London is a part of this. So there's some medical books, but there's also like the know-how of civic governance as well that appears in this. And it seems like there was a marketplace, a concerted marketplace for little informative books that all of these publishers were taking part of, because when 500 books get printed, the publisher isn't selling them one by one. The publisher is wholesaling them to other booksellers, and they're trading books. So I print 500 copies of something on Herbals, you print 500 copies of a book of urine analysis, and then I'll give you 20 copies of mine, and so on, and we exchange. So the books get distributed through that mechanism of inter-publisher trading, and that tends to be how books get distributed.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I had a question about the indigeneity of the books. Does that hold true throughout the kind of long history of the Herbal, that they are always kind of nationally discrete, or as the history goes on, do they start to become kind of like encyclopedia volumes of all plants everywhere, anywhere?
They're starting to become, there's kind of both, it's a both and kind of question. So on the one hand, they are encyclopedic in that you have these explorations, you have Raleigh bringing a bunch of plants, bringing potato vine back, right? And giving it to his friend John Gerard, and Gerard planting it in his garden in the 1590s and making it flourish. And that being celebrated as a kind of look what we can do, look at novelty. Gerard has this fantastic garden in Holborn, and he's just showing it off to anybody who wants to see it. And he's publishing lists of his plants. So on the one hand, there's that great collecting impulse that turns into the massive colonial botanical enterprise of the 18th century. So there's that, yeah, definitely. But there's also this ambivalence about that is threaded through, particularly in England, which starts the game of nationalist botany so late relative to what the Germans are doing. And the Italians, and they're quite insecure about it. And you can see this. And the botanists are fighting with each other in this republic of letters. They want to know what somebody else is publishing, if they have those plants too. And they want to make sure that they're getting credited for being first to do something with a plant or discovering something about how this plant propagates. So the authority and the credit is sort of baked into the printed book itself.
Any other questions?
Thank you for this. I was really struck by the claim that the small books produce a market for the large books. And I wondered I had a couple kind of queries around that. One, are there other examples of that in the London book trade? Are there small books in other types of fields that are producing a market for the large format books? And in particular on the herbals, is there a case to be made or a possibility that there are actually two markets and that there's a continental manuscript trade of books that are owned by the upper end of the market, and that those folks then just have those on their shelves and then buy the folio when it comes out and skip the bottom part of the market entirely? Are there examples of people that own both the octavo and then the larger format? So yeah.
That's a fantastic question. And I haven't directly tried to approach that question that way, but now you make me want to think more about that. The short answer is there's very, very few copies of these books around. So that's a hard thing to kind of, that's a provenance question that would be worth unpacking. And these little herbals were thought of as not being worth much. They've always been talked about as not being worth much. And so I think they got I think they've been handed around quite a lot, and they get kind of caught up. That said, the Great Herbal, which is the first illustrated herbal printed in 1526, is also kind of caught up as a small kind of worthless herbal, or is talked about as being fairly worthless. It's just a translation. It's got a lot of Galenic nonsense, Galenic doctrine. It's not really worth anything. It's got fair enough, but John Locke owned it and wrote his name in it, and and that copy is in Cambridge. So that kind of answers your question a little bit. So I wouldn't be surprised if, investigating that question, I could trace one of the little octavos to another owner. Of course, they've all been washed, or most of them have been washed. But in answer to your other question, the Shakespeare First Folio is a perfect example of this. Shakespeare's plays, the play quartos that were printed during Shakespeare's lifetime, literally provided evidence that there was a market for this large, giant folio of 1623.
Paul has a question, but I just thought if this will be the last. Is there one more? Okay, you don't have a question. Any last question? Oh, okay.
This is a very tiny question, but I'm curious to know, what were the plants from India and America that this herbal author was trying to prohibit from having enter?
Well, I don't think he was yet. Well, tobacco was seen as deeply suspicious in a ton. The herbal, the great irony of Johnson saying this in 1636 is that the folio, you can look at it, it's outside, is packed to the gills with foreign plants. That book is mostly foreign plants, and what exists in England exists in Gerard's garden. that has been brought to him, or examples of it that have been brought to him. Johnson himself was fascinated with bananas, which was his great, just as Gerard was fascinated with potatoes and appears holding a potato blossom in his portrait. Johnson sticks a bunch of bananas in the title page of his book because he, and I'll show it to you outside, he gets this bunch of Bermudan bananas from someone that had obviously been cut quite early when they were green, and he hangs the bananas in his apothecary shop until they ripen. And in 1597, John Gerard had only seen a pickled banana that had been brought to him via Aleppo, he says. And so he could not really speak to what a banana was. So Johnson is like, well, I've got this bunch of bananas and now I'm going to tell the world about this and it's going to go into my book. And so he dissects a banana in two ways and has a sketch made and then a wood block made. And so that wood block is in his. So here's this elaborate other object, but it has no, it stirreth to generation, I think is what a banana does. So it gets you a little enticed, I think is the phrase. So let that be my closing remark, I suppose.
It's also a wonderful segue for the reception outside. So the banana is a good start for thinking about something to eat, so timely. And please join me in thanking Sarah Neville for a wonderful talk.